Centuries before the birth of Christ, the citizens of the Greek city-states and those of Persia were uneasy neighbors. And by the end of the 6th century BC, many of the Greek trading settlements in Asia Minor had fallen under Persian dominion. 2 Persian military expeditions were beaten back by only the narrowest of margins at Marathon, at sea near Salamis, and at Plataea the following year. With the unifying threat posed by the Persians thus weakened, the victorious coalition of Greek cities dissolved into vicious infighting. Meanwhile, Philip II of Macedonia was building a powerful modern army with more heavily armoured phalanx and heavy cavalry for mobility. By 338 BC, Philip had conquered the whole of northern Greece, and the remaining Greek forces moved to counter this new threat at the Battle of Chaeronea. Having crushed Greek resistance at Chaeronea, Philip installed himself as the head of the League of Corinth. This gave him control over all the armies of Greece, and he immediately set about his long-avowed desire to reclaim the Persian-ruled Greek cities in Asia Minor. In 337 BC, Philip sent an advanced invasion force under his most experienced general, Parmenion, across the Hellespont to establish a foothold in Asia Minor. But in 336 BC, Philip was suddenly assassinated, and his young son Alexander had to move quickly to establish himself as undisputed king. Alexander immediately had all suspects executed, and then marched to Greece, where he summoned a meeting of the League of Corinth, and forced the city-states to confirm him as rightful heir to Philip. He then quelled minor uprisings in Sparta and Athens before turning north to quash the unruly barbarian tribes. And when the city of Thebes rebelled, it soon learned what would become of those who dared defy Alexander. He razed the city to the ground and enslaved the entire population. For the time being, Greece was pacified, and Alexander turned his attention to the east and the Persian Empire. The advance force under Parmenion had been held up by the Greek mercenary leader Memnon, who was fighting for the Persians. When Alexander arrived with an army of 40,000 men, he immediately confronted Memnon at the Granicus River. After victory at the river Granicus, Alexander installed Callus, commander of the Thessalian cavalry, as satrap at Dascylion. He then marched south towards the cities of Sardes and Ephesos, which promptly surrendered to him. Next, he sent Parmenion west to subdue the other Greek coastal cities in the region, and continued south with his main army towards the city of Miletos. With the help of a vastly superior Persian navy, Miletos provided stout resistance, but Alexander eventually outmaneuvered the defending army and claimed the city. Accepting that the Macedonian navy was no match for the Persians in open water, he sent it home. Alexander would instead defeat the Persian navy by capturing all of its bases along the coast. He now marched south again towards the heavily defended city of Halicarnassus, where Memnon had been gathering another army since his defeat at Granicus. At this time, Alexander would not let Memnon slip from his grasp. The taking of Halicarnassus gave Alexander an opportunity to consolidate his gains and to prepare for the trials which lay ahead. Parmenion was sent with a strong contingent of cavalry to patrol the coast and harry the Persian navy whenever they came ashore. Another officer, Ptolemy, was ordered to return home and gather reinforcements. Alexander then continued his march, accepting the surrender of several towns along his route before turning north for Gordium. Here he was rejoined in the spring of 333 BC by Parmenion and Ptolemy with their reinforcements. Gordium was home to the fabled Gordian knot, a knot so fiendishly complex that no man could untie it. In typical style, Alexander slashed it with his sword, declaring that it did not matter how the knot was undone, only that it was. Resuming his advance, and after a failed Persian attempt to halt him at the mountain entrance, known as the Cilician Gates, Alexander took the city of Tarsus. Here the Macedonian advance was delayed as Alexander fell ill with a fever. Encouraged by this apparent sign of weakness, the Persian king Darius gathered a great army of some 600,000 men and prepared to march in pursuit. Alexander recovered and continued his march along the coast, whilst Darius travelled through the mountains to appear unexpectedly at the Macedonians' rear, cutting their lines. Far from being intimidated, as anticipated, Alexander turned and force-marched to face the Persians. His comparatively small force came upon the vast Persian army on the banks of the Pinarus, on the cramped ground between the mountains and the sea. Darius's advantage of surprise had been lost, and the Macedonians' swift march had caught the Persians in a place where they would struggle to properly deploy their huge army. Even so, the mismatch in numbers made the prospect of defeat for the Macedonian king almost certain. Darius fled the wreck at Issus, heading east for the river Euphrates. And so Alexander resumed his strategy of capturing the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean. As the Macedonians headed south towards Egypt in 332 BC, they accepted the surrender of several Phoenician cities, including Damascus. The well-defended island city of Tyre did offer some resistance, but eventually fell when a mole was constructed to link it to the mainland. Angered by the Tyrians' defiance, Alexander had 8,000 of them killed and over 30,000 sold into slavery. A similar fate also befell the residents of Gaza, and in the face of such examples, any further opposition crumbled. The Egyptians had never been willing Persian subjects, and they welcomed Alexander, who in turn offered tribute to their gods. Alexander then travelled to visit the oracle at Siwa, who confirmed him as the son of Zeus. In securing Egypt, Alexander completed the capture of the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, and in 331 BC was free to push on into Asia in pursuit of Darius. But the Persian king had been gathering another huge army to his banner, and was moving to block the Macedonians near the river Tigris. Alexander captured several of the Persian advance guard, and was astonished to hear that the Persian army consisted of over 1 million men. Calling on the formidable resources of his vast kingdom, Darius had also summoned scythed chariots, elephants, and some 40,000 cavalry. He had also learned the painful lessons from Issus, and set about deploying his troops near the village of Gaugamela on a wide plain where he could fully exploit the advantage in numbers. Undaunted as ever, Alexander marched with his men through the night to attack on the morning of October the 1st, 331 BC. After the defeat at Gaugamela, Darius fled to the mountains, gathering what troops he could. Though keen to pursue him, Alexander first secured the key cities of central Persia. Babylon and the administrative capital Susa offered no resistance, and in so doing avoided any rough treatment from him. The Persian royal palace lay southeast of Susa at the ceremonial capital Persepolis, with mountainous terrain in between. Alexander's general Parmenion took the baggage train along an easier but longer northerly route, whilst Alexander took the shorter route through the mountains. In a high narrow entrance known as the Persian Gates, Alexander encountered a strong Persian force, commanded by the satrap Ariobarzanes. The Persians seemed to be in an unassailable position, but a local shepherd showed Alexander a hidden path, which enabled him to outflank and rout them. Defenceless now, Persepolis too surrendered, leaving the Macedonians free to loot its treasury and burn the palace down. Now Alexander was free to take up the pursuit of Darius once more. At camp one night, Alexander received word that Darius had been found bound in golden chains and close to death in a wagon beside the road. Unwilling to run any further, the Persian king had been stabbed and left for dead by his desperate generals. Alexander honoured the dead king, burying him with full ceremony and vowing vengeance on his killers. It seemed that all that remained for Alexander's victory to be complete was to subdue what little resistance remained in northeastern Persia. Once that was achieved and garrisons were established throughout the region, his men may have looked to enjoy the fruits of their labour as masters of the known world. Alexander's ambition seems to have found a new focus at this point, and the first seeds of dissent among his men were sown. Decreeing that his men should each take a Persian wife, he seemed intent on integrating the Greek and Persian cultures. He had Parmenion murdered after executing his son for supposed treachery, and in Bactria he killed Clytus during a drinking bout. The core of his army remained loyal, though, even when in 326 BC his attention fixed upon India as his next conquest. In accepting the submission of the Indian city of Taxides, Alexander made an enemy of King Porus, who ruled the lands to the east. Porus gathered an army of perhaps 60,000 infantry, cavalry, chariots and elephants, and awaited the Macedonians on the far bank of the river Hydaspes. With his army broken, Porus was captured, but Alexander, impressed by his bravery, reinstated him. Porus proved a valuable ally as Alexander sought to pacify the surrounding area. Still, his restless spirit seemed unsatisfied, and it became apparent that he planned to continue on down the Ganges to take the unsettled empire of Magadha. He also voiced plans for a naval expedition back across the Mediterranean to conquer Carthage. This was a step too far for his exhausted men, and an officer, Conus, found the courage to speak for them. When told that his troops would rather return home than continue with him on his road to personal glory, Alexander stalked back to his tent in a rage. After 3 days, the situation remained unchanged, so Alexander bowed to the inevitable and agreed to return home. True to character, though, the homeward route which Alexander chose was not straightforward and presented further opportunity for battle and conquest in the Indus Valley. On reaching the Indus Delta, he assembled a fleet which was to support his land army as it marched westward across the desolate Gedrosian desert. However, the monsoon separated the two forces, and there was great loss of life amongst his men from thirst and heat exhaustion before they reached safety at Susa. Alexander returned to Babylon, intending that the city should become the capital of his new empire. Flushed with success, and firmly convinced of his own divinity, Alexander's behavior became increasingly despotic. This, coupled with further measures to mix the Persian and Greek troops and cultures, led to unrest, including a full revolt at Opis. In 323 BC, Alexander's plans for the construction of a fleet to attack Arabia and Carthage were well advanced when he fell ill with a fever. 10 days later, at the age of 32, Alexander died. When asked on his deathbed who was to succeed him, he replied, "The strongest."